The shells began falling at 0730 hours on July 1st, 1916, and Private Thomas Ashworth pressed himself against the forward wall of the trench, counting seconds between impacts the way his sergeant had taught him. 1000, 1002. The earth convulsed with each detonation, showering dirt into his collar, filling his mouth with the taste of cordite and clay. Somewhere to his left, a man was screaming, but the artillery drowned out everything except the raw physics of high-explosive meeting soil. This was the Somme, and the British guns had been firing for 7 days straight. 1.5 million shells, they said, enough to obliterate every German position between here and Berlin. Ashworth had believed it at first. How could anything survive such violence? But now, crouched in the mud with his rifle clutched against his chest, he understood the terrible arithmetic that would define the next 4 years of war. The bombardment was immense, yes, but it was also perfectly predictable. The German soldiers opposite how long the barrage would last. They knew that when it stopped, British infantry would climb from their trenches and advance across no man's land. And they knew they had perhaps 10 minutes between the last shell and the first wave of attackers to climb from their deep bunkers, set up their machine guns, and prepare to kill. At 0830, the bombardment lifted. The sudden silence felt like a physical pressure against Ashworth's eardrums. Officers' whistles shrilled along the line. He climbed the ladder, emerged into daylight, and began walking toward the German positions across 400 yards of cratered ground. The machine guns opened fire before he'd gone 20 paces. By nightfall, 20,000 British soldiers were dead. Another 40,000 were wounded. The German lines remained intact. Artillery had failed not because it lacked power, but because it had given the enemy time to prepare. The warning was built into the weapon itself. You couldn't hit a target without first ranging your guns, and ranging required firing adjustment rounds that announced your intentions to everyone within miles. 12 years later, and 4,000 miles away, 2 American artillery officers sat in a sparse classroom at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, contemplating the same problem with the intensity of men who had witnessed its consequences firsthand. Major Carlos Brewer and Captain Orlando Ward had both served in France as individual weapons rather than components of a larger system. The United States Army Field Artillery School occupied a windswept corner of the Oklahoma plains, far from the centers of military power and prestige. Infantry officers commanded divisions. Cavalry officers led charges into military legend. Artillerymen calculated firing tables and argued about trajectory equations in buildings that smelled of chalk dust and gun oil. It was unglamorous work, the mathematics of violence, and it attracted a particular type of mind, methodical, patient, willing to spend years perfecting systems that others would never notice until the moment they proved decisive. Brewer spread a map across the table between them. The problem, he said, tapping the paper with his finger, is time. We give them time to react, time to take cover, time to prepare. Every ranging shot is a telegram announcing our intentions. Ward nodded slowly. He was the quieter of the two, a man who thought in equations and saw warfare as a problem in applied mathematics. What if we could eliminate ranging entirely, calculate everything in advance, fire for effect on the first round? Impossible, Brewer said, but his tone suggested he was testing the word rather than accepting it. The variables are too complex: weather, barrel wear, ammunition lot variations, survey errors. You'd need perfect data, and from one battery, from all of them simultaneously. If every gun in the division fires at the same target, At the same instant, the first shells to land are also the last shells to land. No warning, no time to react, just instantaneous destruction. They called it time on target, and the concept was elegantly simple in theory. Calculate the time of flight for each gun to the target. Work backward to determine when each piece must fire so all shells arrive simultaneously. Coordinate across multiple batteries, multiple battalions, even multiple divisions. The result would be a single devastating moment of impact instead of a prolonged bombardment that gave defenders time to seek cover. The execution, however, required reimagining artillery from the ground up. Traditional doctrine treated each battery as an independent unit, commanded by an officer who selected his own targets and directed his own fire. Time on target demanded centralization, a single fire direction center that could coordinate dozens of guns across miles of terrain, calculating firing data for each piece and transmitting orders with split-second precision. Between 1928 and 1931, Brewer and Ward developed the mathematical framework and organizational structure for centralized fire direction. They created standardized procedures for survey and meteorological data collection. They designed communication protocols that could handle the information flow required to understand why artillery needed to become more complicated when the current system seemed adequate for peacetime training. The Army adopted their system slowly, grudgingly, with the institutional enthusiasm of an organization being asked to abandon decades of doctrine for an unproven theory developed by two obscure majors in Oklahoma. By 1941, centralized fire direction existed on paper. Whether it would work in combat remained an open question. The answer came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, and it was nearly catastrophic. American forces in North Africa, facing Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps for the first time, discovered that having revolutionary doctrine and actually implementing it under fire were entirely different challenges. Units broke under pressure. Officers reverted to familiar methods. The careful coordination required for time on target dissolved into chaos as batteries fired independently, ranging shots announced American positions, and German armor exploited the confusion with devastating efficiency. The defeat was humiliating, but it forced a critical choice. The Army could abandon centralized fire direction as too complex for combat conditions, or it could enforce the system with iron discipline and refine it through failure. General Omar Bradley chose the harder path. Officers who couldn't or wouldn't implement proper fire direction procedures were relieved. Work because it had to work, because the alternative was accepting that American artillery would remain predictable and therefore survivable. By December 1944, when the Wehrmacht launched its final desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest, American artillery had transformed into something the German army had never encountered. The 12th SS Panzer Division, veterans of the Eastern Front who had survived years of Soviet bombardment, advanced through the snow expecting the familiar pattern: ranging shots, gradual intensification, time to disperse and take cover. Instead, the world ended without warning. One moment, Panzer Grenadiers were moving through a quiet forest. The next, hundreds of shells detonated simultaneously across their position. No preliminary rounds, no gradual buildup. Just instantaneous annihilation. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers had developed survival instincts based on artillery's predictability. You heard the ranging shots. You took cover. You waited out the bombardment. Time on target eliminated every warning sign. Death arrived without preamble, without the chance to react, without the possibility of survival through skill or experience. prisoners captured after TOT strikes described a new kind of terror. "We could not understand it," one German officer reported. "The shells simply appeared. There was no adjustment fire, no pattern. We could recognize company was gone. How do you defend against an enemy who gives no warning?" The introduction of the proximity fuse added another dimension to this nightmare. Traditional artillery shells detonated on impact, which meant soldiers could survive by lying flat and letting the explosions pass overhead. Proximity fused shells exploded in the air above the target, raining fragmentation downward in a lethal cone that eliminated the protection of prone positions. Combined with time on target coordination, proximity fuses created kill zones, where survival became a matter of pure chance rather than tactical skill. The culmination came at Operation Plunder, the Allied crossing of the Rhine, in March 1945. Nearly 4,000 guns from American, British, and Canadian forces coordinated their fire in a display of systemic warfare that represented the apex of artillery development. The bombardment wasn't just massive, it was precisely orchestrated across multiple national formations, different calibers, various ammunition types, all synchronized through a fire direction network that spanned hundreds of square miles. German defenders facing this onslaught experienced something beyond conventional military defeat. They confronted an enemy that had fundamentally reimagined warfare as an engineering problem, where individual courage and tactical brilliance mattered less than systematic coordination and industrial capacity. The Wehrmacht had built an army around the concept of superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence. American artillery represented the opposite philosophy: victory through standardization, through patient development of systems that could scale across entire armies, through the unglamorous mathematics of coordinated fire. Post-war assessments revealed uncomfortable truths that challenged popular narratives about World War II. Artillery, not tanks or infantry, caused the majority of casualties in the European theater. The most decisive American weapon wasn't the Sherman tank or the M1 Garand rifle. It was an organizational framework invisible to cameras and newsreels. Time on target strikes and centralized fire direction killed more German soldiers than any other American weapon system, yet they received a fraction of the historical attention devoted to armor battles and infantry heroes. The revolution succeeded for reasons that revealed deeper patterns about modern warfare. America's peacetime investment in organizational thinking, the willingness to let obscure officers in Oklahoma reimagine doctrine, created advantages that only became apparent under combat conditions. The choice of systems over individual heroics ran counter to military tradition, but aligned with industrial age realities. Wars between industrialized nations would be won by the side that could integrate weapons into unified systems, not by the side with the bravest soldiers or most brilliant generals. Critical to this success was industrial capacity that could sustain unprecedented ammunition consumption. Time on target strikes used shells at rates that would have bankrupted earlier armies. A single coordinated fire mission might expend more ammunition than an entire World War I. Battle. American factories produced shells by the millions, shipped them across oceans, distributed them to forward positions, and maintained supply chains that ensured guns never fell silent for lack of ammunition. The mathematics of coordinated fire meant nothing without the industrial base to feed it. German officers, analyzing their defeat in the years after the war, identified American artillery as the weapon they feared most. Not the strategic bombers that destroyed cities, not the tank divisions that broke through defensive lines, but the invisible system that made artillery unpredictable and therefore psychologically devastating. "We could plan for tanks," one Wehrmacht general wrote. "We could dig in against bombers, but against their artillery there was no defense. They had eliminated the warning that made survival possible. The philosophical implications extended beyond military history. Modern warfare had entered the computational age before computers existed. Centralized fire direction required processing information and coordinating actions at speeds that pushed human capability to its limits. Fire direction centers operated as analog computers, with officers and enlisted men performing calculations that would later be handled by machines. The system worked because it was designed to work within human limitations while achieving superhuman results through coordination. This represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought. Individual soldiers still mattered, tactical decisions still influenced outcomes, but victory increasingly belonged to the side that could build remained important, but they operated within frameworks that determined whether their courage would be wasted or amplified. American artillery in 1944. 1945 demonstrated that properly designed systems could multiply the effectiveness of average soldiers beyond what elite troops could achieve through skill alone. The lesson for modern readers transcends military history. Organizations facing complex challenges must choose between relying on exceptional individuals or building systems that make average performers effective. The American choice: invest in systems, enforce standards, accept short-term complexity for long-term advantage, proved decisive against an enemy that emphasized individual excellence and tactical flexibility. Time-on-target strikes represented warfare reimagined as applied mathematics, where victory came from solving coordination problems rather than demonstrating superior courage. The revolution began in obscurity, developed through patient theoretical work, survived the test of combat failure, and ultimately achieved results that changed the nature of modern war. By 1945, American artillery had become the most sophisticated battlefield system on Earth. Invisible to those who measured military power in tanks and planes, but absolutely decisive to those who understood that modern warfare rewarded coordination over heroics, systems over individuals, and patient organizational development over dramatic tactical innovation.